What's up, everyone? Welcome into DodgerHeads, presented by DodgerBlue.com, also a podcast, part of the Blue Wire Podcast Network. My name is Jeff Spiegel, joined today by Justin Lorber, a.k.a. Future Dodgers, here to do a little recapping of the 2023 MLB Draft. Justin, I know you do a lot of preparation for this. This is one of the highlights of your year. Did it live up to expectations? Not specifically to the Dodgers, but did the draft live up to expectations for you?
I think so. And it was a pretty fun year. It was a good class. There was a clear kind of top five, and kind of maybe unlike other years where there's maybe a clear top three, top five, whatever it is. Top five went in order in the first five picks.
Well, let's talk specifically about the Dodgers. That's why we're here. The Dodgers class, I would say, has gotten mixed reviews, and maybe that's the nicest way I could put it. Over on The Athletic, Keith Law starts his article by saying, "I am flabbergasted by the Dodgers 2023 draft. I usually love their drafts, and their track record in the draft under director Billy Gasparino is among the best in the industry. This year's draft, I did not get." You look over on ESPN, Kylie McDaniel, maybe a little bit more favorable towards the Dodgers, more of the guys sort of in his top 300-ish prospects. So before we get into specific names and maybe your favorite or least favorite picks, just give me your overall thoughts on, are you more in line with Keith Law, who is maybe confused or frustrated or disappointed, or Kylie McDaniel, who seems to be, based on his rankings, maybe a little more bullish on the group of guys the Dodgers potentially added?
I think it's a mix of both. I think the way that I am looking at this class is, if you really look at day 2 and day 3, so after the first and second rounds, this really looks a lot like a Dodgers class would, like the last few years. There are a lot of arms with good fastball traits or high velocity, something for their development guys to mold and work with. There's some hitters with interesting traits. But yeah, I think you look at essentially everything outside of day 1, and if you had shown me this class a week ago, I think it looks fine. I think where the difference is from prior years is the two guys that they took in the first 2 rounds, Kendall George, who's a high school outfielder from Texas, and Jake Geloff, who's a third baseman from Virginia. Not that they're bad picks, they're just not really the type of players the Dodgers have gone for this high in the draft. And maybe Geloff to a lesser extent, because there have been a couple of times where the Dodgers have taken like corner infield backs. Cody Hosey is one. Michael Busch was considered a corner infielder in that draft, and then ultimately was announced the second baseman and has played basically all second base since joining the organization. But they just typically haven't taken those kind of power hitting cornerbacks, power over hit guys this high, maybe lower rounds, day 2, day 3, but not as much on day 1. With Kendall George, pure speedster, elite, potentially elite defensive center fielder, menace on the base paths. That's not a type of player who, there just aren't as many guys like that who go super high because of the way the game has changed and how power and hitting the ball with force and exit velocity is more of a factor than I think, if you look at a draft maybe 10 years ago. So these guys just aren't as highly valued, I think, in the game as they used to be. And also just not someone who the Dodgers have, not an archetype the Dodgers have typically drafted super high. I think the closest comparison that I can think of is a guy like Jake Vogel, who they drafted in the 3rd round of 2020 so far. Hasn't exactly panned out. And I think when it comes to a player like that, there's 2 ways to look at it. And the first is, when he gets on base, like, he's a threat every single time to steal second and third base, and maybe home sometimes, like Ellie De La Cruz. But also, like, the defense is going to give him a really high floor. So, like, essentially what you're hoping for is just the offense develops, and then the other stuff is already kind of there.
Yeah.
On the other side is, he's not a super small guy, but he's, this frame's a little bit smaller. He's not considered, to be someone who's likely to be a power hitter.
Yeah.
So, you're really putting a lot into that bat developing from a hit tool perspective, not necessarily from a power perspective. With a guy like that, you hope he adds on weight and, beefs up a little bit to impact the ball. But you're not looking for him as a guy who, is going to hit 25, 30 home runs in the future. That's just not the type of player he is. And so, you're putting a lot into that hit tool and whether that will develop.
Yeah.
And, sorry, go ahead.
I was just going to say, I feel like I must be getting more educated because Jake Vogel was the guy that I thought of when I saw this draft pick. And Cody Hosey was unfortunately the guy that I thought of when I thought of the Dodgers' second round draft pick. And so neither of those is necessarily the most encouraging comp in the world. It's not to say that they have to fall down the same path as a couple guys who haven't necessarily panned out. One thing I did want to ask you on the George front, though, kind of an interesting story that came out shortly after he was drafted. He basically went ahead and said, well, I thought the Dodgers were going to draft me at number 60 in the second round. So walk me through kind of, that's new to people that maybe aren't super familiar with the MLB draft. They're hearing that and saying the Dodgers thought they could get this guy at 60 and they end up drafting him at 36 instead, 24 spots earlier. Those are premium picks in the midst of those two. So it feels like when I hear that, there's a little bit of disappointment. Should I be disappointed that George said out loud, hey, I thought I was going to be a second round pick, and instead he ends up in the first round?
I mean, it wasn't just him saying it. It was also Billy Gasparino, too. And so I think what happened there is they had a guy that they liked who they had a deal with or were hoping fell to them at 36, who ultimately did not. And they got sniped. And then, they had to adjust. They had a deal with, or presumably had a deal with George lined up. They decided it was better to keep that, take him early, and just kind of adjust later on than try to, do something on the fly. And we don't know who that pick might have been. I think, if you were to look at each of the 35 guys that went before them, at least half of them weren't getting anywhere near pick 36. So you might be able to make some guesses, but that's ultimately what I think happened. I don't think from a strategy perspective, it's really that bad of a thing, especially because there were guys available at pick 60, like a Jake Geloff, who I think should have also gone as high as pick 36.
Yeah, and I think Geloff was ranked higher by both Law and, by McDaniels, and I believe on MLB.com's rankings. The Dodgers' second round pick was actually ranked higher than their first round pick in both of those rankings. What were you going to say there?
I was just going to say, I think this draft probably looks a little different if Geloff is the first round pick and George is the second round pick. I think in that scenario, it's still like, well, still a couple of guys, a couple of archetypes the Dodgers haven't really trended towards. And, it mentioned Cody Hosey and Jake Vogel. Those aren't necessarily comp just so much as like, similar buckets of players.
Yeah.
So, it's not to say that, oh, well, neither of those guys has panned out so far. That means, we should worry about these picks. Even if they were like reasonably close comparisons, every player is different, of course. But I do think there would be a difference in perception if Geloff had been the first round guy, just because he was, considered maybe end of the compensation round, which is where the Dodgers were picking, to, anywhere in the second round was his range.
Well, let's talk through more specifics. I'm going to throw the list up for those watching on YouTube here. Again, Kendall George, high school outfielder, was the pick at number 36. Jake Geloff, second rounder, third baseman out of Virginia. He was picked 60. Brady Smith in the third round, pitcher out of high school. Wyatt Crowell, a pitcher out of Florida State in the fourth. Couple compensation round picks in the fourth. Dylan Campbell, outfielder from Texas. Eric Swan, pitcher from Middle Tennessee State. And then 5th through 10th was Joe Vitrano, first baseman from Boston College. Brian Gonzalez, shortstop out of Puerto Rico. Patrick Coppin, pitcher out of Marshall. Jaron Elkins, outfielder out of high school. Ryan Brown, pitcher out of Ball State. And then Sam Mungeli, shortstop out of Sacred Heart. If we continue this through the 11 through 20, Carson Hobbs, pitcher out of Samford. Noah Ruin, pitcher out of high school. Alex Makarowicz, pitcher out of Northwestern State. Jackson Jelkin, pitcher out of Community College in Arizona. Jordan Thompson, shortstop out of LSU. Javen Coleman, pitcher out of LSU. Luke Fox, pitcher out of Duke. Sterling Patrick, high school pitcher. Spencer Green, pitcher out of high school in Washington. And then DJ Ugalele, you might have heard of him. He plays quarterback for Oregon State, also listed as a two-way player. Has not played college baseball, though, at least not for Oregon State. So, Justin, as we go through that, and that's a bunch of names that I threw at you, I'm curious for you, do you have a favorite pick somewhere on this list? Doesn't necessarily mean the guy that you think is going to be the best player, but maybe somebody that you paid attention to beforehand or a value that you like, or anything really here? Favorite pick out of the 22 guys? Is that right? Did the Dodgers end up with 22 players in this draft class?
Yeah. Uh, in terms of value, I really like Ryan Brown in the ninth round. Um, Ball State righty, uh, fastball, mid 90s velocity with carry. So, kind of the fastball traits that they look for. Phenomenal changeup. Had the highest whiff rate among like changeups and splitters among that bucket of pitches. I don't know if it was in college or Division One. I remember seeing the stats somewhere, but really, really high whiff rate. He just had Tommy John, so probably not a guy who we'll see in action until at some point in the summer of 2024. Probably not, up at full speed until 2025. But I really like the value there. That was something that they did a few times, taking guys who are just coming back from Tommy John or underwent Tommy John fairly recently. Wyatt Crowell, the 4th round pick, as well as Javen Coleman and Luke Fox, the 16th and 17th round picks. All those guys are Tommy John guys, and fairly recently. Coleman is the furthest away from the surgery. He just came back mid-season, and the others are still in recovery. But that's something that we've seen them do. Draft class over draft class is go after guys who maybe wouldn't go that low if they were healthy, and hope one of them's worked out. Obviously it has worked out for the Dodgers in a few different scenarios.
Yeah, and it's worth pointing out to those that are unfamiliar with MLB draft stuff is the Dodgers now have to go out and sign all of these guys. And so some of them, presumably, they have deals already in place, as we mentioned with Kendall George in the first round. But the Dodgers are on a budget. They get a certain, basically, stipend per pick that they have in the first 10 rounds. Those are all valued. And then you get, I believe, is it $100,000 that you can spend up to for every pick, 11 through 20? Is that right?
150.
150. So basically, there's no guarantee. As you look, if it's a high school guy, you're basically bidding against their opportunity to go to college. If it's a college junior, you're bidding against their opportunity to go back for their senior year. I mean, junior college kids, same thing. So there's basically, I don't think they drafted any, basically people that have to sign, right? As I'm looking through this, they're all juniors or high school kids or community college kids. So I guess Sam Mungeli there is listed as a 4-year senior, but even that's hard to tell because with COVID, some of these guys have a 5th year of eligibility. So do you know with him, does he have the option to go back to school?
He does. He actually, he had announced a transfer to Auburn fairly recently, but I think it was a day ago, news that came out that he's planning to sign his deal.
Perfect.
Which, guys in the top 10 rounds, almost always sign, especially guys outside the top 3 rounds, because the only compensation picks you get if someone doesn't sign are in the top 3 rounds. Round 4 and 10, if no one signs, you just lose that pool space too. So that's also the difference from day 3 is if one of those guys doesn't sign, it does not affect the total draft pool. If you lose one of the guys on day 1 or day 2, that eats into that draft pool.
Got it. All right. Well, going from favorite pick, is there a player on this list that you would sort of classify as maybe the most confusing pick to you? And it could be, I mean, it sounds like maybe George or Geloff could fall into this bucket a little bit just based on maybe prototypes that we're unfamiliar with. But is there a player on here that, again, we're not saying this player is going to be terrible, but maybe was most confusing as a fit within the organization or most confusing from a value perspective?
I think on both ends, it's probably George with the archetype player and just where he was, ranked, at least among the public rankings. 30 front offices, you need to get 30 different sets of rankings. One thing I'll say is I think it speaks to what they think of him to take a guy like that this high.
Yeah.
I was talking about this with someone right after the pick is not the type of player I would take unless there are some true outlier traits there. That they think are, going to be really beneficial to his development. And so maybe that's the case. And, it's hard to tell with those high school guys because you don't have the kind of data set that you would with a college player.
Yeah.
But that would be my guess for a guy that, doesn't necessarily project as a middle of the order hitter. There are probably some outlier traits there that, maybe we'll get to see in action pretty soon.
Yeah, for the Dodgers to go outside of their norm, it must be something special that draws them to it, is what I hear you saying. And I mean, with him, part of it is I wonder, we know the struggles the Dodgers have had in the running game, both from a pitching side, but also they haven't done a great job of stealing bases. So maybe they feel like there's sort of an inefficiency with speed, and they go and draft the guy Kendall George, who most people say is literally the fastest guy in the entire draft, 80 grade speed. So we'll see how that one plays out. Last question here. Is there a sleeper pick somewhere amongst this group? I know that could be kind of the favorite pick. Could be asking the same question, but is there a guy maybe in the 11 through 20 rounds here that jumps out to you, say, hey, keep an eye on this one. This could be interesting if he signs, and seeing what happens?
Yeah. So I think I mentioned Javen Coleman and Luke Fox as two guys who had Tommy John surgery fairly recently. Fox, I believe, was last fall. Coleman had his during his sophomore year, and then he came back to pitch during this season. He actually pitched a little bit in the College World Series. Both of those guys, if they have 3-year healthy college careers, potentially go a lot higher in the top 10 rounds. So I like both of those picks. And Jordan Thompson was another guy who I think if you look at some of the public rankings, probably the highest rated player that they got on day 2, a guy who a lot of people thought, would go somewhere on day 1. So if he signs, I think that would also be a pretty good get there in the 15th round.
Yeah, I was going to say he was the guy that jumped out as I was reading your Twitter and the people that you were retweeting throughout the draft. He seemed to be the guy that people were most excited about. I know Kylie McDaniels had him as a top 150 player. They end up getting him in pick 460. DJ there in round 20 is interesting. And as a college football fan, I'll tell you why it's interesting. A, because as people are starting to tell stories of when he pitched, I don't believe, did he play at all in Clemson, Justin, or was it
No.
just high school, right?
High school.
But I mean, this is a guy that in high school was throwing mid-90s. Obviously, if you've seen him, he has a massive build. So you could imagine him kind of trying to figure this thing out as either a pitcher or as a hitter. But I would just say the thing that's most intriguing to me is the football career hasn't really played out the way that he anticipated it was. He was the number 1 recruit in the country when he came out of high school. He goes to Clemson, has early success filling in for Trevor Lawrence. But then when it's his shot, he kind of falls on his face to the point that he transfers away to Oregon State. Now, he's basically got 1 year at Oregon State, I think, maybe 2. They do have a good program, a good coach, so it could figure it out. But I just thought that was an interesting pick, because if you told me that 9 months from now, he's looking at getting drafted on day 3 of the NFL draft in like the 5th round because he can't figure out accuracy-wise and isn't processing quickly enough, like, is there a point where going and trying out baseball for the Dodgers becomes a better or more appealing option than playing football? I'm not saying it's likely. I'm just saying, Justin, for me, I like the dart throw there with DJ in round 20.
Yeah, I mean, obviously it's a really interesting pick. My eyes kind of went up when I saw it come across like the draft tracker, and I was like, he transferred. He's the quarterback. Really interesting pick. And look, I think some of the reporting that's come out in the last couple of days from the LA Times and the Athletic, there's some interest there from him. And, this isn't just the Dodgers throwing a Hail Mary, complete long shot. Like, they think this is a 1% chance. From what it sounds like, they do think there's a decent shot that he'll pitch for the organization. And I think Billy Gasparino also mentioned in some of his press availability that the further constriction of the U.S. domestic roster limits next year are going down even further than they are this year, affected a little bit what they did on day 3, going for some higher upside players who they might not be able to sign, but if they can, great.
Got it. Yeah, so he can sign with the Dodgers, play minor league or spring ball or something, and still play college football, right? Like, I've kind of been confused, but when I was at the University of Oregon, Dennis Dixon was playing some form of baseball with the Braves while still being a quarterback for the University of Oregon. I didn't fully understand that, but I don't know how much you know about how all that works.
I don't know much in terms of the rules. I do remember Kyler Murray is the big example, who taken, I think, 9th overall by the Athletics. And this was before he started. He was still a backup at this point. He signed his deal, but he wanted to play football. He wanted to see out, see what he could do as a starting quarterback for Oklahoma. And then everyone knows what happened. He wins the Heisman. He goes number 1 overall and tells the A's they can, just mind their own business.
Yeah.
Which, from a business perspective, smart move on his part. Nothing wrong with that. And we'll see. Maybe a similar thing happens here, and he has a great year and ends up being an NFL draft pick. For what it seems like, that's Plan A. He's going to try to do his best with the quarterback, see if he can advance there professionally. And if things don't work out, baseball might be a Plan B. Definitely the most interesting draft pick the Dodgers have had in a while. That's for sure.
Here are the quotes. This is from Dodgers area scouting supervisor Jonah Rosenthal. Quote, "I think the plan is to allow him to play football this year, try to be successful and try to be as much as he can do. And then in the meantime, if it doesn't work out or if baseball truly becomes his passion and love and what he wants to do moving forward, I mean, he could be in spring training with us by next year." He continues, "Honestly, he could have been a top couple round guy if he had stuck with baseball out of high school, but he became a 5-star quarterback coming to Clemson. When you have that status, I mean, obviously you run with football." So there you go. Interesting. So they basically would have his rights for essentially a year, right? Like if he decides to play baseball anytime between now and next year's draft.
I think so. That's the way it seemed from the reporting, although I'm not 100% sure on how that would work.
Okay. All right. Lots of confusing stuff. So sorry for putting you on the spot with a couple of the you don't typically have to figure out how college football and professional baseball can fit together. But Justin, we appreciate you joining us as always. Make sure you check out Justin's stuff at Future Dodgers on social media, futuredodgers.com as well. I know he's got a prospect update coming soon, so be on the lookout for that. Justin's the best guy that I know of doing Dodger prospect stuff, so his stuff, I would say, is definitely worth a look. Justin, thanks again for your time. Everybody, thanks for joining us. As always, please subscribe, ring the notification bell here. Tons of content coming out in the coming days and weeks as we approach the trade deadline. My name is Jeff. Enjoy the rest of your day, and go Dodgers.